Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 3 of Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. And once again, it's my perspective and the history that I've studied, the experiences that I've had as a byproduct of Italian immigration, Sicilian immigration, being full-blooded Sicilian. And I'll do the best I can. And today, I want to talk to you about Mussolini and the church and his relationship with the church, which was an up and down battle in many ways. But I also believe it's a relationship that ends with some very positive benefits that I think Mussolini's never given enough credit for, though the bumps in the road have to be acknowledged. I think on the question of his personal faith, Mussolini was a guy that I believe grew into his Catholic faith, and I believe he converted at the end of his life. And there were steps and signs along the way, even though he was extremely fallen, right? He was a passionate man, particularly he had a special taste for the ladies. Infidelity was part of his life. And so he had an up and down, turbulent kind of a struggle with his Catholic faith. We'll also get into a little bit of what is called the conciliation of the church, right? Which leads us, of course, to once Mussolini is in power, his relationship with the church, particularly the Lateran Accords, which makes the Catholic faith the central, or should I say, the integralist sort of religion of the nation, after the church being in a state of turmoil with the Kingdom of Italy since the Italian Revolution, or the Italian Civil War for that matter. And really, Mussolini, to his credit, answering the question Romana, right? Who was going to solve this issue between the Catholic state and the Catholic faith? Because you had a situation in Italy where you had Italians and they were also Catholics, but the church and the state were at odds at one another since the Civil War, particularly when the revolutionaries had taken the church lands away from the church, and the church response was that Catholics in Italy were not to acknowledge the government, they were not to acknowledge Rome as the capital, and Catholics were not allowed to vote in elections. The church has stipulated that. And this was a period where the Pope enclosed himself in the Vatican for some, I think it's 60, 70 years, in the midst of a very, I would say very little, but a liberal monarchy that was not going to relinquish back its land or its power, that it was at odds with the papacy as it was anyways. And so somebody had to deal with all these divisions, right? Because you got a nation that's been unified, right? They're all Italians now, but they're also Catholics. And this is a day and age, unlike today, where the faith was strong, it was vibrant. And when the Pope spoke, Catholics actually listened, especially in Italy in those days. Now, I get it, the apostasy is worldwide, it's a different ballgame. But this was a real problem, the question Romana. And it would be something that Mussolini were to eventually solve, right? So I think where we start here is with Mussolini himself. Now, this is difficult to judge a man's heart, right? Where the state of his soul is. Nobody can do that. Only God can do that. All I can do in regards to Mussolini's sort of faith, whatever it is that he believed, all we can do is look at the circumstantial evidence. And ultimately, that's kind of a thing that between him and God. But I think we can see some things, especially an evolution of a man that, again, I believe had a conversion at the end of his life. Now, of course, one of the charges that I've seen by classical liberals and liberals throw out is that, you know, when we talk about the Lateran Accords and Mussolini bringing the church in and making it part of the Italian state and giving the church certain rights back and certain powers back, that this was a self-aggrandizement movement by, you know, a political leader who just wanted to consolidate power. And as typical, what I would just say to premise that, this is how classical liberals think. Everything has to be governed through the prism of political machinations, right? even the supposed intentions of an individual, no matter how outwardly we can kind of dissect and look and examine, it is because he was in a position of power. He obviously used the Catholicism for his own benefit, that were enhance his power, while he's in charge of Italy, of course. And that's one of the charges that you get. And it comes down to, again, the classical liberal notion of reducing everything down to the scientific method or the political method in that manner, which really cements, in my opinion, the damaging effects of liberalism, because you can never see past the material world, right? Everything is solved through political principles at the end of the day. And while certainly I would acknowledge politics, and there's things we have to deal with in this world, to judge a man's soul because he's in power that he could never possibly sincere in his belief, is one of the great mistakes made by classical liberals, right? And so we have to examine closely, and I'll give you some of the inferences. I'll give you some of the direct notions that partook of his life and how he kind of, matured into his faith, or what appears to me, at least. I could be wrong. Again, I can't judge the man's soul, but I can give you some of the evidence that I have found, at least, right? And so I think where we have to start with Mussolini is from his youth. When was he born? 1878, I believe. I could be wrong on his date. But his father was a devout Marxist. And that young Mussolini was a Marxist from early on. He followed his father's footsteps. Father was a blacksmith. Mother, on the other hand, was a school teacher who was a devout Catholic. And so he got his Catholicism from his mother, what it looks like. Now, it's a strange scenario when you have a devout Catholic woman that marries a Marxist man. But then again, marriage in those days was a little different, right? A little more straightforward, most likely, even as a Marxist, I would imagine his father probably was culturally Catholic, because like I said, everybody was Catholic to a certain degree. If you were practicing the faith, you're most likely culturally Catholic. Anyways, I don't know if his mother and father got married in a church or not. I haven't read that anywhere, but that's the general narrative that we get. And Mussolini followed his father's footsteps, went into a Marxist path, or path, I should say, or a socialist path, and followed his father there in his early days. And with it, again, the moment you go down the path of Marxism, you're in that gray area with faith and religion, because the ideology really preaches against that, right? It's really inherently anti-Christian the moment you become a Marxist. And so with that came a real wild side with Benito Mussolini. He was very passionate. He was very, kind of blunt and could be violent at times, very aggressive with the ladies, always bragged about his affairs, things of that nature. And without a doubt, there was something there from his youth that kind of persisted. And I think it's fair to judge that him delving into Marxism at a very young age, it probably disordered his relationship with his faith that he might have got from his mother's side. And it was something that he would have to grow into. And Mussolini said when he was young, he never denied God, but he questioned it, right? He questioned everything in regards to faith and religion. And a lot of people have attributed his lack of faith early on to sort of that youthful invincibility that I think most of us, if not all of us, kind of go through when we're young, right? We're in denial about certain aspects of our faith because we want to pursue the world. This happens more and more now. And as we get older, through wisdom and experience and through alien bodies and the inevitability of, our eternity and where we're going to go after this world kicks in. And a lot of times we mature and we come back to the faith. I think that's clearly something that Mussolini, I think, went through. And so he was an atheist early on. But you begin to see some signs, and I'll fast forward a little bit. I'm going to give you lots of anecdotal sort of examples of what I've seen. I can't fill in all the gap. Obviously, this is more difficult with the person's sort of personal faith and judging his soul. So all I can do is lay out the evidence. But as we fast forward on into past his Marxist year, past World War I, and then eventually into his time in power, is when many have speculated that Mussolini was a full-blown atheist at that time. And generally, when you're reading history books, especially written from the liberal side of the aisle, they're going to tell you that he was an atheist. What they don't fill in is that there's more nuance there as you begin to read the man, study the man very closely. Now, my recommendation would be, if you want a comprehensive view on Mussolini, is a book by Nicholas Farrell entitled Mussolini, A New Life, written in 2005. And Nicholas Farrell does a wonderful job really giving you a balanced view on Mussolini, right? He gives the good with the bad with Mussolini. I think it's a very fair and respectful analysis, and it's a big book. It's a comprehensive look at Mussolini and what he does in the book. He has an entire section devoted to the conciliation of the church and a lot of the things that Mussolini did throughout his life concerning his faith. And I think one of the issues too that I think I have to bring up, one more book actually, is his own autobiography. Let's see here, My Rise and Fall by Benito Mussolini, which there's some indications about his faith. Now, again, this book was his own writings. What's interesting about this book, remember, Mussolini comes to power in 1922. This book was all written before 1926, and it's a time when it seems to be written between 22 and 26. Then when in regards to his own autobiography, we have a big, about 17 years without any of his own personal writings. And the book picks up in 1943, where he is now in charge of the Republic of Salo. I say in charge very loosely. It was really Hitler that was in charge. It was when Hitler put him in charge, or at least as a puppet leader of the Republic of Salo. It is there that Mussolini starts to realize his time may be short as the Allies are coming in. The war's not going too good. At that point, Mussolini was hoping for a stalemate from the war. And Mussolini, understanding sort of his humanity and things that are going on, he was deposed by the king as the leader of Italy, starts writing again. And this is where I think we begin to see some of Mussolini. Now, I have not read that part of the autobiography yet. I read the first half of the autobiography, which was I believe between 1922 and 1926. And in that, he says something interesting, because this is the period that supposedly he was an atheist. But what's interesting and what's typical of Italians is that, Italians may go through a period of spiritual dryness, but in many ways, to be Italian is to be Catholic. They're almost inseparable, right? This is why when you talk to Mormon missionaries that try to go to Italy to evangelize Italians, they can't do it, because the faith is so intricately tied to the culture and ultimately the state, it becomes very difficult. So even when Italians go through a state of apostasy, their cultural Catholicism really, it resounds in them. That's why there's always this great hope toward the end of life that Catholics can come back. In the case of Mussolini, writing before 1926, again, apparently, as other historians have said, this was his period when he was an out-and-out atheist. Even in his autobiography, at one point, he acknowledges that he's a Catholic. He's a Catholic. Now, it's a small thing. It could be a cultural thing. His faith could be lukewarm. His faith could be, whatever I mean. But at least he called himself a Catholic in that period of history, which is fascinating to me. Now, we skip forward, of course, to more turbulent times in his life. I believe one of his children, might have been a daughter, got very sick. And what we know from Mussolini was that at this period of time, suffering through the agony that a lot of parents suffer through when they see a sick child, especially when you believe your child may be dying, we know that Mussolini begged God and the Holy Mother for his child's life. He grabbed the rosary of his mother, who had now have been deceased. He held it up. He kissed it, begging for the life of his child, begging God and the Holy Mother of God. Again, something simple, anecdotal, but it tells me something. I believe this is the 1930s. And as we progress in his faith, finding what we also know, after he was deposed by the king, he was a period of time before he was put on Mount Sasso, because that's where Hitler captured him or rescued him, however you want to look at it, with gliders that were flown in there. He was temporarily put on the island of Ponzo, which is, I believe, on the west coast of Italy. And there he spent some time in a prison after being deposed by the king. What we know from his time in Ponzo, from a testimony of the priest on the island, he said that Mussolini did read the book, The Life of Christ, and that Mussolini requested if the priest could say a mass for his deceased son. I believe it was Bruno, who died in an airplane crash, if I remember correctly. And he asked the priest to say a mass for his deceased son, which, again, this is after 1943. He's older now. His legacy, he's realizing it. He's disappointed with how things went down during the war, being deposed, right? This is before he would be, again, captured by Mussolini. Later on, captured by Hitler. Later on, as he's moved to Mount Sasso, and you got this daredevil stunt performed by Hitler, sending in Otto Zelensky, I think his name was, is some guy, daredevil guy that used gliders to go in there. What's interesting about that story is it was all BS. It was a propaganda ploy by Hitler, right? Because Germany actually controlled that region of Italy after Italy turned to the other side on the Allies, and the Germans could have drove a vehicle up there to grab Mussolini off the top of that mountain. But for the sake of propaganda, war propaganda, Hitler conceived an idea to do what was to show a daredevil rescue to save the Duce, right, from being arrested. And that's what they did. That the gliders came in, they landed. It was a very short runway. They had to move a bunch of rocks, but Mussolini gets on the glider, they take off, and straight to Germany Mussolini goes, which at that point, Mussolini was thinking to himself, I'm done with this. I'm done. I'm out. I'm not the leader of Italy anymore. I just want to go spend time with my family. But Hitler didn't rescue him and go through this trouble for nothing. Hitler wanted him for his own propaganda uses, and then puts him as a puppet leader of the Republic of Salo, which we all know Mussolini never had any real power there, right? But nonetheless, at that period of time, while he is in Salo, it has been said that Mussolini at that time was hearing mass and going to private confession from the priest there. We know that as well, too. So we have some great examples there. We also have, and I'm not going to get too deep into this, we have the mystics, Catholic mystics, that have confirmed that Mussolini had a conversion at the very end of his life. Now, I'm not gonna go too deep into that because I need to do some more verification on these things, right? But it is widely known that there has been some Catholic mysticism that has said that Mussolini did convert at the end of his life. And so these are some examples that I can think of right now off the top of my head. And I think it's pretty clear that Mussolini, again, is getting in age, he was gravitating toward his Catholic faith. Now, his relation with the church was interesting. And this is where we get into the political accusations of the self-aggrandizement of Mussolini, right? That he gave to the church what he did only for the sake of his power. Okay, I mean, that's possible without a doubt. But the amount of power he actually gave to the church was actually quite remarkable. And I'm not sure if there's a political leader in modern times that's actually ever done so much for the church. And I got to be honest with you, if not for his disastrous decision to ally himself with Hitler, and if he could have cleaned up all those adulterous affairs, dare I say, we may be talking about Saint Mussolini. I'm just throwing that out there because what he did for the church was remarkable. Obviously, answering the question Romana, this great division since the Italian Revolution was just the first step. But in the process of this, he gave the Vatican lands back. And this is the deal they cut, right? They had to cut a deal. Because at this point, Italy is a nation, and the monarch doesn't want to give the lands back to the Vatican, right? The papal, what we know as the Papal States before 1870. But this question has to be solved because where are your loyalties if you have a nation that's 95 to 98% Catholic and devout Catholic at the time? If you're the monarch or even the extended constitutional government where do your loyalties lie? If you're an Italian, is it with the church or is it with your government? This is a problem for the government. They have to consolidate this relationship if they truly want to govern, especially because you had a constitutional monarchy that was known to be corrupt at the time. And so trying to codify this relationship between church and state was huge in Italy. It's something here in the States we won't ever understand because we've never had that type of relationship with any church or the Catholic Church itself. We've kind of flaked away with this religious indifferentism. You do you, I do me. As long as we don't cross each other's property lines, we don't shoot each other, kind of a thing, right? You pick your own personal moral codes. I got my personal Jesus, and we don't bother each other. And as a result of that, we're a nation at each other's throats because we share no common faith, no common culture, no common values, no common rules, no common faith in that matter. And this is why Americans have been at each other's throats. Really, with every generation since the founding of the country, for the most part. But in a homogenous nation like Italy, that's Catholic, it's a little bit different. No, you got your movements there, right? And there was Catholic movements that were to the left over there, right? You had what was it? And this is where a lot of negotiation things happened later on with the Cattolica Azione, it was called, right? It was the youth movement in Italy, and who was going to get them first, right? Was it going to be the fascists or was it going to be the church, right? Which this confliction basically between the church and the fascist regime conflicted with one another. Because Giovanni Gentili, who was one of the authors and one of the grandfathers of fascist movement, his point was, you can't, if you bring the church in, it's going to conflict with fascism because somebody has to dictate the rules, the conditions of the day. If the church is mixed in with fascism, we're going to have conflictions. But he also realized that, again, Italy being a Catholic nation, how do you deny this? At first, the fascists tried to relegate the church into a corner. Okay, we'll bring you back, but we, the government, the fascists, are in charge. We're going to form the youth and future fascist generations. Pope Pius XI said, hold on, time out. No, that ain't going to work. No. If we're going to be a Catholic nation and we have a country that's overwhelmingly Catholic, right? The church has to be in charge of forming the youth. And this was a major confliction in 1931, which led to an encyclical called Non Abbiamo Bisogno. And it was Pope Pius XI basically condemning fascism and Benito Mussolini, right, for taking the kids ideologically away from the church. These are the kind of battles they fought. Now, Non Abbiamo Bisogno was written, but Mussolini would not allow its publication in Italy. So Pope Pius XI sends it to France, and it's published in France, right? And of course, the French are happy to publish it because they're liberals over there and they're anti-fascists, of course, over there, and they publish it. So it was a fascinating thing, but eventually, as always seemed to be the case with Mussolini, he worked it out. They got back to the drawing board. It became a compromise of sorts. And what you have is Mussolini says to Pope Pius XI, listen, the problem with Cattolica Azione, I believe was pronounced, was that it's a breeding ground for Catholic anti-fascism, and which is a problem for us, right? We're a fascist state. We want to promote the idea of fascism, and therefore we can't have a bunch of these kids being raised in this Catholic organization as a bunch of anti-fascists. So the deal they cut during that period was that Mussolini and Pope Pius XI said, all right, here's how we're going to work it out. As long as Cattolica Azione is not a political entity and stays out of politics, the church can have the kids first in this organization. And Pope Pius XI agreed to it. And remarkably enough, this 1931, after 1931, there was relative peace between the church and the fascist regime all the way up until 1938, until we get the Jewish discrimination laws, which is something different, which has something more to do with with the failed Austrian painter more than anything else, and we'll talk about that another time. But that encyclical that a lot of even Catholics still quote today as a condemnation, they worked it out. And not only that, no, it was after, I believe, that encyclical that Pope Pius XI awarded Mussolini with the greatest honor that a civilian or a non-clergyman could get in church. Awarded him, I believe it's the, what is it, the Holy Cross of the Secular, I forgot what it's called. It's in the book here, but it's one of the highest honors a lay person could receive, and the Pope awarded that to Mussolini. He also went on to say that after the 1929 Lateran Accords, that Mussolini was a man sent by divine providence. Now, you could tell me that he did it for his own aggrandizement, but the church reacted to this stuff, and the church told you where they were at with Mussolini at the end of the day. Now, I know a lot of American Catholics are going to be uncomfortable with this because of the negative notions of fascism in liberal societies after the fact. But this is what was going on at the time. It's more than just self-aggrandizement and Mussolini using this, unless you're saying Pope Pius XI was a fool, was a damn fool, which I don't think he was. Pope Pius XI, unlike Pope Pius XII, was very strictly doctrinal, very conservative. Now, Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, he was a diplomat. That was his job before he ascended into the papacy. And he felt, and that's where a lot of the negotiation things take place later on with the Nazis, things of that nature, and how he feels he has to do with it. It's two different papacies, and how they dealt with these world events was different because of who they are and what their experiences were. But to take a very dogmatic, a very staunch conservative papacy to say he was fooled into believing in Mussolini, that's a tough one. Mussolini had to give up real power. And now we get to the 1929 Lateran Accords. So I'm going backwards here, right? I'm going backwards here. And so this is the question Romana. How do we bring it back around to make Italy Catholic again? And to satisfy the Catholic need to, again, codify this relationship with the state, the monarchy, and the constitutional government. Well, Mussolini brings them together, brings the king in, of course, and the queen. They get the documents together. Now, Mussolini started negotiating this relationship with the church pretty much when he got into power, I think. I mean, now, let's see. 29 is when the Lateran Accords happened. I think he started negotiating this deal with one of the bishops or cardinals in 1926. I don't recall the name of the cardinal now, who it was, but it took some time. And they codified this relationship. The king signed the document, the church signed the document, and basically, in a nutshell, the stipulations were that the church would get the Vatican lands along with the summer retreat, Castle Gandolfo, I believe is what it's named, right? They would get that. But the church would have to acknowledge a couple things. One, they're not going to get Rome. They're not going to get their papal lands back, okay? And that the church would now acknowledge Italy as a state and Rome as its capital. In turn, the king and the fascist regime, what Mussolini negotiated, what was it now? Let me think for a second here. That's right now, I remember now. In turn, the state would give the church back, I think it was something like 600 million lira, all the money they had lost because of the land and the upkeep and all the time of the lost lands and the damage done to the church since the Italian Civil War, right? It kind of retro pay, right? Whatever you want to call it there. Something like 6 million lira, a bunch of bonds as well, too. So it set the church up financially for all the losses that it had incurred over the past 60, 70 years. On top of that, here's where things get interesting. Not only does Italy become the integralist voice of Italy, the official church religion, the way they worked out religion, of course, this is not a religious liberty state in Italy, is that conscience, the conscience clause, you can follow the faith any way you want, but other religions are not allowed to proselytize in any serious way. And this is kind of the deal they cut. no discrimination against minority religions, but they were not allowed to proselytize because the Italian or the Catholic Church was the official, again, religion of the state. In that matter, to go on, and this is where it kind of gets impressive for me, and if we had a political leader this age that gave us this, we'd be partying it up like Kool in the Gang, right? Celebrate good times. Mussolini gave to the church marriage, the institution of marriage. It was a prerogative of the church, not the state, interesting enough. He gave the orphanages to the church. He banned contraception. He banned divorce and remarriage. He closed down all the dirty bars in Rome, like 50 of them or something like that. What else did he do? He began a program on motherhood. He wanted to expand, again, the Italian population in order to compete with the United States and Britain and France. He felt the population had to grow. So with these provisions of no divorce and remarriage, or at least he gave that to the church, however the church dealt with that in regards to bad marriages and annulment, things like that. It basically gave the prerogatives of marriage to the church, right? Banned contraception, but it started a program to endorse childbirth, paying families for every child, and encouraging motherhood, elevating motherhood in the state of Italy, giving out awards and giving honors out to mothers, anything to encourage. And we've seen these things in modern times as populations have fallen, right? We've seen it in Hungary, we've seen it in Russia, all these more orthodox kind of nations going toward, we need to increase our population growth. Well, Mussolini was doing that. And of course, the church couldn't be happier about that, right? That's one of the basic tenets of our faith, be fruitful and multiply. Of course, don't get me started on abortion. Abortion was illegal as well, too, at that time. So there was a lot of great power that Mussolini gave to the church in his negotiations. And it was Mussolini that brought them together. You can say it was the king that signed the documents. That's fine, because Mussolini is the prime minister to the king. But it was Mussolini and his regime that made this happen at the end of the day. Now, did the church and the fascist state butt heads at times, like I mentioned earlier, right? With Cattolica Azione, I believe it's pronounced, right? Yeah, it did. But see, what you got to remember is that fascism, not only was it a new ideology per se, but fascism was not very doctrinal. It wasn't like liberalism. Fascism kind of, the way I take it, I could be wrong, okay? I could be wrong on this, but the way I've read it, it was very malleable and was willing to adapt. And so when Giovanni Gentili says, and Mussolini are debating, how do we bring the church in without gutting the soul of fascism from Italy? It's a huge debate. It's a huge debate, which to me is very interesting, because I don't know because Mussolini makes this all happen with the church. He codifies this relationship. If it's another fascist leader that rises other than Mussolini, you could have very well have had an atheist leader in charge of this fascist movement, which you're like, whoa, that brings some concerns. So he seemed to be, to me, the right guy at the right time in history. It's one hell of a circumstance, but it is what breaks down ultimately. Now, you could say Mussolini did it for his own self-aggrandizement. Fine, you could believe that. But what kind of leader, what kind of government surrenders the institution of marriage? Who does that? You think we're going to get any Western liberal republics to do that? Or any communist nations to do that? Who does that? Because really, the control and the stability of civilization, as we said so many times, is within the family of society. It is the building block of society, the family. That's what the Marxists have taken from our current civilization, and why nothing makes sense anymore. But Mussolini surrendered that power to the church. Who does that? Who? Can we get any American president to do that at some point? Nobody's even tried. We dangle with democracy. Okay, let's do the Defense of Marriage Act, which is nothing. It's tinkering to make everybody feel better, when in fact the state has no right in regards to marriage. That's a prerogative of the church. But of course, we have no church in place in the modern state. So how can you give it to the church? If all you can do is give it to individual churches in a society that is governed by the principles of individual rights, which effectively means marriage is handed over to every individual. That's what that would mean. And that would be crazy for a government to actually do that. That's why, whether we like it or not, the government has to control marriage here in the state, in this country. The libertarian, well, the government should just let it go. It's never going to work. It will never work in that manner, because there's a symbiotic relationship between people and its government. You're going to need government regardless. The question is how you structure government. That's the big question here. And the moment you remove the church in favor of individual rights, you got a problem. And this is why, despite all the talk of libertarianism, government has gained more and more and more control over the institution. Libertarians want to go backwards. Oh, we need to divest the government. The government doesn't want a secular government, I should say. It's not going to divest anything. It wants the institution. That's why you need the institution protected by the church. Mussolini realized this. He gave it over to them. Now you can say, again, political machinations at play, but what leader does that? What leader gives away that institution, right? Who gives away the orphanage? I mean, if you're going to indoctrinate people into fascism, wouldn't the orphanages have been perfect in a way, right? But he gave that to the church, the hospitals controlled by the church. Oh, let's not forget, under Mussolini is where the crucifixes went back in all schools and all local government buildings as well, too. Again, under Mussolini is when Italy became a Catholic nation. Now, you had a lot of Catholics in there. Of course, these were divided provinces many times, control different regions, different entities. But once Italy becomes whole, it becomes unified. It's not officially Catholic until Mussolini. That's the irony of it all. And so we get the situation, finally, in the end, that Italy becomes Catholic because of Mussolini. What does that mean at the end of the day? Well, you tell me. You tell me. And this is why I would tell you that when traditionalists on the Catholic side talk about the current crisis in the church, a lot of them want to say that, well, the crisis started at Vatican II. No, it didn't. The crisis started before that. I think it actually started in the 19th century, sometime in the 1800s, during all the Masonic revolutions throughout Europe. But I think if you want to pinpoint the final nail in the coffin that will really seal the crisis in the church today, was with the death of Mussolini. He was the last temporal leader protecting the church. And he did that. He protected the church. Wasn't always a perfect relationship, but at the end of the day, even Pope Pius XI acknowledged it by giving him the highest award a lay person could ever receive in the church. It was a fine relationship all the way up until the war. The war changed everything. The war is where Mussolini gets lost. It was a terrible decision on his part to enter that war. He was warned to. And so history won't forgive him for that, and rightfully so. I will say that, rightfully so. But there's an interesting side of Mussolini. I think he was a good and strong leader. Again, he was a guy that was not moved by this, what is it? The material dialectic, as the Marxists would say, which I think infects really not only just the Marxists and the communists, but also in some ways also affects the conservatives and the liberals out west, where everything is about external economic and material output. Mussolini absolutely rejected that, hated that idea. He believed that, as one of my commenters in the comment section said, he believed in a life of honor, right? Tradition, custom, culture, history, people, things of that nature, the faith, right? He brought the faith in, which was critical in Italy at the time. And I think in that sense, I think he deserves some appreciation. But again, I know what the history books are going to say. There you have it. That's kind of the relationship between Mussolini and the church. In a nutshell, I'm sure as I dig through, pour more through many books, I'll be able to unveil more of that relationship, which I think is very interesting, very fascinating. I think all Catholics should take a look into, because I think he did a lot of things. I just can't think of many Catholic leaders that did as much as Mussolini did for the church. I'll be honest. I know Garcia Moreno was great down in Ecuador. It was 1700s, I believe. King Louis IX was a a saint, right? But that was in the 12th century, what, 11th, 12th century, right around there. I know there's probably been a few other kings as well too that are doing great. But in modern times, I mean, you can think of what you want, but he did great things for the church. And I don't think it was simply for power, because he actually gave up power in order to get this thing done and to seal this relationship between Catholicism and Italy. And I think it was a beautiful thing. There you have it. I want to thank you for joining me tonight once again. It's a topic I really like and enjoy, and I hope you guys enjoy it too. I do my best. I've read through a lot of books and talked to a lot of family in the past, trying to get an understanding for this as best I can. I could be wrong on some of this. My analysis could be completely off. I know that, but I give to you what I've read, what's been presented to me, and I share with you all. I would love comments in the comment section. I think it's a great discussion, or topic to discuss, I should say. And I want to thank you once again for joining me. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.